What is up, guys? Rick Cacus here, and today we're going to be discussing hashtag Buff Primaries 2017, formerly known as hashtag Buff Primaries 2016, the single greatest movement within the Destiny community. But for real, guys, Buff Primaries is one of the biggest parts of the Destiny community culture right now. Every single time I make a video, one of the top voted comments is someone saying, you know, it's a joke, and you click read more and it says primaries. And it's just such a huge part of the culture. If I was to go up to a Destiny fan and just go, what do they need to buff? I guarantee the majority of answers would be primaries, and then a couple of sick freaks saying skip grenades, but that's beside the story. Buff primaries, and just people saying buff primaries, and people calling for primaries to be buffed, is again such a huge part. You see it everywhere within the Destiny community. But how do we get to this point? How did hashtag Buff Primaries 2017 and 2016 become so huge? What does it actually mean? And what can be done, and what are the effects of buffing primaries? Well, today we're going to discuss all of that. But first, guys, if you enjoy this topic, enjoy this content, please remember to support it by liking, commenting, and especially sharing. It's a simple thing, but it really helps me out. So, let's talk about the Buff Primaries movement, because it is pretty interesting in the sense that when people say buff primaries, I think a lot of people aren't necessarily talking about buffing all primaries. This has kind of become like a shorthand saying for buffing a lot of the down in the dumps primary archetypes within Destiny. Because if I was to say, alright guys, tomorrow we're buffing all primaries in Destiny by 10%. I think a lot of you would go, wait. Maybe don't do that to the clever dragon. So there's a couple of primaries, certainly, that are seeing play in the current meta. And though we're going to go over the competitive archetypes, and then we're going to go over the non-competitive archetypes, and we're going to talk about those differences and talk about what can be done to those non-competitive archetypes. But before we do that, I do need to say that anytime I talk about, archetypes or gun types that aren't competitive versus the competitive meta, I always get people saying, oh, I do well with that weapon. I said the Dreg's Promise wasn't very good. I'm always getting people saying, wait a minute, I love the Dreg's Promise. I got someone saying I went flawless with the Dreg's Promise. Firstly, who are you matching against, and how can I match against those people? Because, oh my goodness, I match against sweaties who just use the meta. You're apparently matching against people without thumbs. That's a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but I think a great example of a personal experience that showcases that personal experiences aren't necessarily the best for determining whether a gun type or an archetype is good compared to the data and the meta and just the majority of people using and not using weapons is, again, my own personal experience. I was streaming Iron Banner one time. Some of you guys watching the video may even remember this. I was streaming Iron Banner and I wanted to have some fun. I didn't want to use pulse rifles for the billionth time, so I was like, alright, I'm going to whip out my Adept Vision Stone, the Trials of Osiris auto rifle. And guys, I went off. Like, I just got so many kills, I think 30 plus kills with over a 3.0 KD, just crushed kids in the Iron Banner with an auto rifle. And I was sitting there thinking, my god, like, oh my god, this is actually pretty good. Maybe auto rifles aren't that bad. Maybe they just kind of have a stigma against them, but maybe, if you know what you're doing, they're not that bad. Next round, very next round, we match made against a different team, and these people, they were the sweats. They were just the people who wake up and just embrace the meta. We're talking palindromes, clever dragons, matadors, nothing in between. That's all that I was versing against. And that game was very, very different. I think I went positive, but barely. I got to fight for every single kill. And the main thing is that I just felt outmatched. When I was versing someone, a 1v1 gunfight with no other scenarios, no one's throwing grenades, no one's flanking, it's just me versus him, 1v1 with guns, I felt totally outgunned. He's got the clever dragon with extremely fast, extremely high flinching bursts, and I've got my silly little auto rifle, and I felt outgunned in every range that is outside my maximum damage potential, and I even felt outgunned inside my maximum damage potential. When I'm doing my max auto rifle damage, I still felt outgunned. And there you have a great illustration of, you know, the meta versus the non-meta. No one's saying you can't do well with non-meta guns. Like, no one's saying that. And by all means, if you wreck with auto rifles, don't let me stop you. Like, you do you. But there is a very good reason why the majority of players stick with a small number of gun archetypes, and high-level players gravitate to these small number of guns even more so. So, let's go over the competitive primary archetypes. Firstly, let's start with pulse rifles. It's, you know, the big bad elephant in the room, and the number one pulse rifle archetype is the super fast firing pulse rifle archetype. This includes, of course, the Clever Dragon, the Waltz, and the Grasp of Malik. Next up, we have the fast firing pulse rifles. This includes the Blind Perdition, the Hawksaw, stuff like that. It's still competitive, probably not as competitive in a lot of scenarios as the super fast firing archetype, but you can still definitely make, you know, the Blind Perdition is one of my favorite weapons. You can definitely make that work. People still use this archetype a ton. However, the slow firing pulse rifle archetypes, pretty much anything past that's firing slower than the Blind Perdition, is just not very competitive. And the reason being is because they just don't have the killing potential. They, for the most part, have actually longer time to kills, so the faster firing pulse rifles are killing quicker, and they're less consistent. A great example of this is the absolute highest damage category of pulse rifles. We're talking here with the Spare Change and the Parthian Shot. These pulse rifles actually have an okay time to kill if you land literally every shot to the head. So you need to get the absolute maximum stability roll, or you need to get the best stability possible while still getting head seeker, and you cannot miss a shot. If you get a body shot, you need to land a third burst, and that's going to ruin your time to kill. And this kind of accentuates the problem we have here. We have archetypes that are just clearly the best choice in pretty much every scenario. They have extremely high time to kills, they're extremely consistent, and the other alternatives, you just doesn't make sense to use them. Why would I use the Parthian Shot that I can't even get a body shot? I just ruin my time to kill, when I could use the Clever Dragon, which is going to be perfect in most engagements. It kills basically just as fast, and if I miss a burst, I get a follow-up burst incredibly quickly. And what's even worse about pulse rifles, and the reason I'm going kind of in-depth into the pulse rifle archetypes debacle, is that this same stuff is going to apply to the scout rifles, to a little bit the auto rifles, all that stuff as well. But what's even worse about the higher damaging pulse rifles is not only do you need to land like every shot in your burst, not only is missing catastrophic, but like God forbid you try to fight someone who's also shooting you back. If someone's shooting you with a Clever Dragon with high caliber rounds, good luck landing all of your shots with all that going on. You're flinching so much. So it just doesn't make sense to use those slower shooting but higher damaging archetypes. They're just balanced so poorly. Alright, now moving off of the pulse rifles, we have the hand cannons. And there is one very competitive hand cannon archetype, and that is the medium rate of fire hand cannons. This includes stuff like the Palindrome. The medium rate of fire hand cannons just make the most sense. They have an extremely competitive time to kill while also being very consistent. There is a faster shooting archetype that kills quicker, but you need to land all headshots. With the medium rate of fire archetype, you don't. You can land some body shots and you'll still get that kill with your optimal time to kill still happening. There's also a slower shooting damage archetype that does more damage. However, it doesn't kill in any less shots, so it actually has a slower time to kill. The slower shooting hand cannon archetype is actually kind of fun. You can get certain perks like Luck in the Chamber, where you can actually turn it into a 2-shot kill if you get lucky enough. But for the most part, that's not very consistent. Competitive players are still going to stick with their palindromes and other guns within that archetype. Now with hand cannons, there isn't really too much that can be done. You could always increase the time to kill of the faster shooting hand cannons to give them more of a reason to use, increase their stability perhaps to make them more consistent in landing all their headshots. With the slower shooting hand cannons, nothing really can be done there without making them extremely overpowered, so they're great as just a fun archetype. Not every archetype has to be competitive, but when like more archetypes are non-competitive than competitive, you definitely have a problem. Moving on though, that's pretty much it for the competitive archetypes. I would say maybe for the scout rifles, we have the Mida archetype. Now this obviously includes the Mida multi-tool, but more recently includes the Distant Star and other faster shooting 4-shot kill scout rifle archetypes. The problem with the scout rifles is that you have archetypes that kill in 4 shots, the Mida archetype, and they kill faster than the Hung Jury archetype, which also kills in 4 shots, but shoots slower. Actually has like the slowest time to kill out of all primary weapons in the game, with like a second. It just doesn't make sense. Why would you use the way slower time to kill one? And yes, maybe you can get one with better range and stability, I guess, but the vast majority of people are going to stick with the Mida archetype, and the Mida itself is such a good gun, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to use any other archetype. There needs to be some substantial buffs to the archetypes of scout rifles that just have not seen play for God knows how long. And one of the main reasons why scout rifles aren't doing so well is because pulse rifles are so prominent. Even if your scout rifle, yes, it may be better at longer range, if you're getting tapped by a clever dragon that's even doing its minimum damage, good luck trying to land your shots through that debacle of flinch, right? So that's another huge problem. And lastly, we have the auto rifles. And unfortunately, they just aren't competitive in the current and the previous to that and the previous to that meta. Auto rifles, since they were nerfed to oblivion, have never been able to regain their full strength. There has been a few times where the absolute fastest firing archetype, with the Doctrine of Passing especially, actually being decent, and people would use that. But aside from that, and aside from that only happening in like 1 or 2 metas, they really have fallen on hard times. And there's a very simple reason for this. There's no reason to use them. And again, I'm going to ruffle some feathers of people who actually like using them, but if you actually look at the statistics, if you're just looking at the numbers, they don't make sense. If you land every single shot a headshot with the medium rate of fire archetypes and the slow shooting archetypes of auto rifles, you will get an okay time to kill. So think about that. If you land like all 8 headshots for the medium rate of fire archetypes, you are going to get like a 0.95 time to kill, whereas with the faster firing pulse rifle archetypes, you're looking at like the same thing or better, 0.8 to 0.95 time to kills. So think about that. Think about that. You have to get every single shot a headshot with auto rifles in close range. God knows they don't have very good range. And if you do, you don't even get that good of a time to kill. You don't even get as good of a time to kill as a normal medium rate of fire hand cannon. Those are 0.8s. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Game balancing dictates that this is just not the right thing to do. It blows my mind that Bungie has actually done this. You need to have a reason to utilize an auto rifle that requires all of those headshots in a row in close range to get, which is very hard in a game like Destiny with so much mobility. You need to have an actual decent time to kill if you do all of those things to reward you for doing all of those things. Furthermore, one of the things that actually made the Doctrine of Passing good, and this is something that for whatever reason a lot of people don't necessarily talk about. It really blows my mind that you wouldn't see more people calling for this, but it's body shot time to kill. One of the reasons that the Doctrine of Passing, the fast rate of fire archetype, was so good was that it actually had a decent body shot time to kill. If you got all body shots, didn't get a single headshot, you would still kill in like a second. And that was actually the same time to kill as if you got all headshots with the Hung Jury archetype. So that's very interesting, right? And that makes those archetypes not that bad in close quarters. When a guy is bum rushing you with a shotgun, or shit is going real and bananas and people are jumping everywhere and they're shade stepping and you're just, jumping around, just holding the trigger, hoping for the best. If you can have a pretty decent body shot time to kill, you don't have to get all headshots. That again is great for consistency and close quarters combat. That could definitely be a direction that Bungie takes auto rifles in order to balance them. If auto rifles had really good body shot time to kills, making them great in close quarters, they would have a reason to use. Again, maybe they wouldn't have the best time to kills, but they would be extremely consistent. Look at hand cannons. The ones with the fastest time to kills, because they require all headshots, usually aren't utilized that much. People are still utilizing the slightly slower firing ones to get that consistency. So, with all that said and done, you can see the problem with primaries. There's about 3 to 4 competitive archetypes and around 11 non-competitive archetypes. When we say buff primaries, again, a lot of people aren't necessarily talking about a blanket buff. We'll talk about maybe that is the solution in a sec, but mainly we're talking about that we're sick of seeing so few primary archetypes actually be viable. Bungie's livestream, where they're talking about what they're going to buff and nerf for the upcoming Sandbox update, is only a few days away. And if they don't address what they're going to do with the fact that so many primary archetypes are just uncompetitive, frankly, that will be shameful. These are the things outlined in today's video that we should potentially look at, that Bungie should be definitely looking at, and that we should expect them to address with this upcoming Sandbox update. Frankly, failure to do so would be, again, shameful. It'll show that Bungie really isn't paying attention to their game and is basically breaking kind of the basics of how to balance a game properly. Auto rifles are the great example. There's no logical reason to use them with what currently exists via other weapons in Destiny. But lastly, I do want to quickly touch on, what about buffing primaries in general? This is more of a theorycraft thing, but it's been floated around for a long time. In year 1, primaries were definitely more potent, and they've been scaled back over and over again with nerfs and nerfs and nerfs. However, this has made a lot of people feel that secondary weapons are just too potent, that too many times, the right thing to do in a scenario in Destiny's PvP is to, instead of actually engaging people with your primary, instead of actually even finishing them off with your primary, the right thing to do is just switch to your secondary. Switch to your secondary, switch to your secondary. I mean, the secondary apes, there's even a term for it, like the apes, man, the guys who take out the shotguns and charge you no matter what. Like, I see them all the time. They just are always shotgunning, charge, shoot, and they actually do pretty well. That's the unfortunate part of the current meta, where it somewhat rewards that kind of playstyle. And an overall buff to primary is even making something like the Clever Dragon even better. And I know that's a scary thought, but if they did make the Clever Dragon, the Palindrome, whatever, even better, but then also made the uncompetitive archetypes even better than that, like properly balanced them, and just made primaries as a whole more competitive, we could see potentially an interesting shift in the Destiny meta, in some people's opinion, for the better. We would have less shotgun spam, because you would be able to gun down people running at you with a shotgun in close range with auto rifles, with pulse rifles, even scout rifles more readily. You would be able to compete potentially with sniper rifles a little bit more often. You'd be able to down people who missed with, fusion rifles, so they wouldn't be able to get that follow-up shot before you could even take them down. All of that stuff. Buffing primaries would make Destiny rely a little bit more on gun skill, being able to land your shots accurately and consistently. Right now, gun skill isn't hugely relied upon in Destiny. Now, that's not to say that people aren't skilled in Destiny, that's not what I'm saying whatsoever. But the people who are skilled, the people who are doing very well at this game, they don't often rely a lot on gun skill. That's not to say they don't have gun skill, but if you play like top tier rated players, they're not killing you from shooting you necessarily. Every time you engage them, you get naded. You get naded, you get meleeed, whatever. It's abilities, secondaries, and maybe, if they have time, they'll shoot you with a Clever Dragon. Right? That is the current situation of Destiny. That people going at it with primaries in 1v1 scenarios where the most accurate person wins is happening less and less and less. Now again, this is just the direction that things aren't going. It's not even necessarily a bad direction. You may be someone who favors that reliance on knowing when to use your abilities and mobility and secondaries and all of that stuff, and switching between all three of those things all the time. But I think I'm right in saying that the vast majority of Destiny players are just unhappy with the current Crucible meta, and that goes beyond just the Clever Dragon and Matador spam, that goes into further game dynamics. And I think Just the main thing that I really want Bungie to do, the main thing that I just really want them to do with the next sandbox update is something substantial. Do something big. Buff something by more than 0 point something percent, for God's sakes. Buff auto rifles by like 5-10%. Let's get some craziness going here. Let's get some differentiation going here. Like, the auto rifles haven't been good for so long, and so many other archetypes are the same. Let's have a shift. Let's have a change. And if they buff something too much, then so freaking what? Like, I'm sick of everyone having this incredibly frigid and scared attitude towards buffs and nerfs. Oh my god, if they buff it by too much, then the auto rifles will be overpowered. Well, if Bungie would actually get off their ass, no offense Bungie, and nerf stuff and buff stuff more often, and we wouldn't have to wait like 200 days between sandbox updates, if they would buff something too much, then they could just nerf it by a little bit. If they buff auto rifles by 10%, it's a little bit too much overbearing. We have some fun with the auto rifles for a little bit, and then we say, hey, it's a little bit too much. Then they go back in there and they nerf them by 3 or 4%, and they try to find a proper balance. No big deal. It's really no big deal. If we move beyond the current thinking and the current traditions with the Destiny Crucible meta, so many great things can be achieved, I believe. Now, if you guys think that as well, I hope you take the time to support this video, again, by liking, commenting, and especially sharing. Now, if you want to see more Destiny content similar to this, don't be afraid to slap that subscribe button. And if you want to actually be notified of new uploads, make sure to press the bell beside subscribe. Now, if you guys want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter at RickCacus. That's linked in the description down below, as is my Twitch channel, which you can also follow. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.